rather than that Node.js would be the best choice. I mean, it's a very opinionated kind of fact what I'm telling you now, but the truth is that for what I believe, other languages like PHP and Ruby and Python and other languages, they have the server-side rendering. They have much better tools for that than Node.js, right? And Node.js is still very early stages, and because it's all JavaScript, it's kind of the tools are not as mature, let's say. And yes, you can have universal apps or isomorphic apps. So we will talk about it in a second. So benefits. What is the benefit of server-side rendering? Speed. Page is viewable, then interactive, versus page is viewable and interactive. We will talk about it again. And SEO. So does anybody know what SEO is?
Search engine optimization.
And what would you imagine under that term?
To me, it sounds it's about being at the beginning of a Google search. So basically, your SEO is optimized if whenever you put in the name of your company, or I don't know, like topics that are related to your company, that it actually shows first.
Yeah, yes, that's correct. There are many sides to SEO. Usually people talk about Google, like being on the first page of results in Google. There are other things like rich content and other things that are still kind of part of SEO, and developers should really think about that. But mainly, what I would say is, when you think about SEO, don't necessarily think about the race to be on the first page of Google, even though that's the ultimate goal. Think more about your content being in a structure that is understandable by computer, right? By a robot. So when we say Google is clever but not yet perfect, it means, when something scans your page, which we call index. So when something indexes your page, it will be a robot. It will be some kind of algorithm that will be looking at your page, and it will try to parse your page and make sense out of it. So, for example, if you use correct HTML tags in your markup, the robot will be able to extract the structure of the page much better. So if I give you an example, if you have a page with a header, footer, and the header, content, and footer, if you kind of split this page by using just div elements, to the robot it will look the same, right? So it will look at the page and will say, okay, I have these three div elements. So this is page consisting of three elements, and then it will probably extract the text from those elements. That's all it will be able to parse from the page. If we change the markup of the page and we actually use the header tag and the section tag, for example, and footer tag and another tags, then the robot will be able to load the page and will say, okay, so we have now three elements in there, and we know that header is here and footer is there, and this is the text for the header and this is the text for the footer, and so on and so on. So it will be able to make much smarter decisions, and hence it will be able to kind of shoot you up into first page or whatever better results, because it will have some kind of algorithms on the background where it will decide, well, the user is searching for this. If I have a page that has this in header, then it's probably very important for that page, so I'm gonna promote it to the first page, for example, right? That would be a very simple algorithm, but it would work, right? So structuring your code well is big part of SEO. It's not just about, there's a very common misconception where people think the SEO is all about the meta tags in the headers, in the header of the page, which is actually funny, and the keywords and the description, which is actually funny because these have all, I think, pretty much all been deprecated, right? So Google is smart enough to actually read the page and understand it, rather than just looking at what you give it as a keywords and description. So because of that, the best approach really is from the developer, not necessarily from the content manager, but from the developer, where they structure the page. They should structure it properly, so it's very easily to parsed by robots, basically. So that's quite common misconception, because you will see that at work sometimes, where you have a small company and they will hire a new person, which will be something like, content optimization or content manager or something, and they will task that person with improving the search position of this company as much as they can, which they can do something, but ultimately it will be down to developers as well to make sure that the page works properly. The same thing with images, for example. So I'm sure that all of you know Pinterest. Pinterest will not index anything that doesn't have proper image right on the page. So you need to make sure how to place the image on the page. Make sure that it has to be an image tag rather than background, for example, and it has to have some kind of size. It cannot be lazy loaded, because then robot wouldn't see it, and so on. And the last point that I just said, that there we're getting into actual server-side rendering versus client rendering. So when I say the image shouldn't be lazy loaded, what I mean by that is, and I might be getting ahead for this presentation, but anyway, what I mean by that is that if the way that the robot reads the page is, it will load the index HTML, right? So it will go to www.domain.com, and it will load the index, whatever is there, but it will not render the page, right? The robot is just a robot. It's an algorithm. It cannot render page because it's not a browser, it's not a user or anything like that. It doesn't have eyes, for example. So it will load the index HTML, and it will look at what's in that markup. And this is the common problem with current single page applications which are not server-side rendered, right? Because what you actually load will be one div which will say, start the application here, and that's all the robot will see. So that's obviously very, very bad for SEO and any kind of indexing. So server-side rendering is better in that sense, because when you actually request the index HTML, then you will already get the full content, right? Because you rendered it, let's say you rendered it on the server, and then you just took the whole HTML that has been already rendered and pass it down to the browser. So you say pass it down to the browser or pass it down to robot, whoever requests that page. So that's the big advantage of server-side rendering. That being said, there is a way around it for single page applications. You can talk about it a little bit more, but with server-side rendering, it's kind of pain-free, and it doesn't need like crazy kind of side applications or configurations on a web server and so on. Is that kind of clear so far?
Yeah. Very abstract but clear. Yeah.
Cool. So let's go back to this. So obviously, server-side rendering page is viewable, but viewable then interactive. So what we mean by that is, when you request a page, it will load the page, and then once it's actually rendered, it will start the interactions. While client-side rendering is where page will be loaded, and at the same time it will be interactive, because it already kicked off the kind of client-side application. That makes it interactive. Server-side rendering. So this is basically what I said. So server receives the request, right? So you will say www.domain.com. It will request the index HTML, and then it will do some work. It will get data from the database, for example. Then it will generate the HTML, and then it will take whatever it generated and pass it down to whoever is requesting it, which will be very likely browser or robot, search engine robot. By the way, I'm calling it robot on purpose because like one way to kind of affect how these robots are behaving is if you create like a robot file in your web browser, because the robot will try to find that file first before it actually starts indexing your page. So they are actually called robots. Yes, so with the server-side rendering, I'm not sure if this is going a bit too far, but there are a couple of common patterns that you could use. I'm pretty sure that Ricardo will know MVC, for example. So, model view controller, which is almost what you see in here. So what does that mean is you have 3 layers in your application. One is model, one is controller, one is view. The model is what takes care of the data. Controller is what actually processes the request, and the view is the generated HTML. Right. So this is a very common pattern in server-side application, in server rendered applications. Yes, there are template literalers. So you can basically create your template as the HTML and then kind of what we call render. So render it. So basically put it into an HTML format in memory that you then serve down to the client that requests it. You can the templates can be as complex as you would like. So, for example, in here you can see that we are putting a values from our controller, let's say, from our code. You can have loops in there as well, so you can repeat elements and so on. To the code a little later, because I'm worried that the connection is not going to be stable. How is the connection so far? Can you understand me, by the way?
Yeah, all good.
Yeah, good. It's draining my phone battery like crazy, though. Right. Any questions about server-side rendering and template literals?
No.
Okay. I'm giving you like a very high level overview because there are so many things involved in this, and I think it's just way out of scope of what you should be learning, not only of this course, but what you should be actually learning at this point, because there's no point learning everything when you might not need it, right? So you will learn these things as you go, depending on your application of what you learn in here. Lodash templates. Lodash is a great library. Yes, it is. Lodash is a JavaScript library, which is basically a collection of tools. They will help you to do. Usually, what you find is that Lodash will have function for the most annoying thing that you encounter during your JavaScript development. So, for example, if you say, I want to be able to get a value from an object based on its path in the object instead of actually writing it. So let me just show you what I mean. So if I open some file, right, and I will write, this is my object. Right, something like this. So this will be my object with some other nested objects, and you will say, well, I want to get foobar Thomas Zoe. I want to get value of this. Now, this is perfectly fine, but what if you have an object where you're not sure if some of these might exist? So you might have to do something like this. You will say if foo, and then you could say if foobar. So you're basically checking if all of these exist, right, to get this value, and so on and so on. And so on. So because if it doesn't exist, it will throw you an error. So this is quite annoying in JavaScript because you basically have to do this. Now to Lodash comes to rescue, where you will have something like get, and you will just say this is my object, which will be cool. And what I want to get is this path basically, right? And this way, even if this path doesn't exist, it will just give you undefined and it will not throw any error. So you don't have to do all this kind of handling to get something from the object. This is now so what you will also find is that a lot of things in Lodash, a lot of these annoying things, they might go away in the new versions of JavaScript. So the new version of JavaScript that's just coming out, you can do something like this. I don't know if you have looked at this before. Right, so you can basically conditionally access stuff.
I don't know if it was with you or with Vasil, but I remember.
Yeah, I think it might have been with me because I kind of vaguely remember we looked at it. So,
yeah, no, I remember, yeah.
Oh yeah, because you were asking me who is making the rules of JavaScript.
Exactly, yeah, I remember that, yeah.
Yeah, so you see, like,
yeah, and we looked at the former.
Yeah. Sorry, what was that? Okay, so yeah, so this is how you would do it with Lodash, for example. I mean, I'm fairly sure this is what it is, but anyway, this is how you would do it with Lodash, and this is how you would do it with new JavaScript, and this is how you would do it with old JavaScript. Right? So Lodash is a library that will give you some kind of tools for the I would say for the most annoying things in JavaScript. Lodash, the name is from dash, but it's low, so it's like underscore, so it's Lodash. And it has a function template, so it has actually built in a templating language. And what we mean by that, obviously, you cannot write in your HTML if you have div. You cannot write some value in here that would be something like foo bar, and it would be changing. That's not HTML. HTML is just a static language, a static markup language even. So the way to go around it is that there are some preprocessors and some templating languages that will allow you to do something like you saw on the slide, like this. So it will allow you to write some kind of like a sugar syntax around the values, around the dynamic values, and it will parse it itself. So for example, in this case, we would do something like this. Yeah, and now this would be in the templating language. This is your HTML templating language. If you give this to the browser, it would just literally print out this in the div, right? Because browser just doesn't know anything about templating language. But you could do this in Lodash. So you would save this as a markup or any other name, right? And then you would run it through the templating language or templating engine, and it will basically give you the correct HTML. So for example, if I take my object from here, we have this, right? So let's just go back and do this thing. So this would be this is how it would look like in your view. So this would be your template or view, we usually call it. And then you would take this, right? So you put it in the template, then you would have something like a second parameter with the actual data. So you could just say, okay, I have this foo. And what would this actually return? It would be something like this. So it would take your values that you give it to, like your variables and stuff, and it would run it through the markup. And in the markup, it would recognize all these extra kind of weird syntaxes, and it would replace all these values with whatever is coming from the variables. And that's how you kind of server-side render. We call it render, but it's more of a processing. That's how you would server-side render an HTML. by having this kind of looking HTML, run it through some kind of templating engine, and it would give you a pure HTML without any syntax that browser wouldn't understand. Obviously, and you might think about this already, this means that once it's rendered, it's rendered. This, if I change now this value to something else, it's not going to change in the template. You would have to run it through the templating engine again, right? So it doesn't mean that if you render it on the server, it will automatically change on the client. It's only the one time that it's being rendered that all these values are being replaced in the HTML. But only then. It's not going to work on a client. If you want to change values on a client, then you would have to do what you were doing until now, where you would have to give it some class or something, and then in JavaScript you would have to change the values depending on some rules and some conditions. Right, so yes, so Lodash, I mean, you can see down here, if you can see it, hopefully it's not too small, you can see that it can get really complicated. So this would be in your HTML, and you would just say for each on the users, so for every user, create a li, which is part of the list, and their name basically, let's say. So then you would create actual syntax with a loop. So you could have something like this. So you could have users for each user, something like that. And then what would you do if I have my users in here?
But basically, this is just to put things in context. This is to when we say rendering the backend, this is basically the goal of this is that the front end or someone gets visibility as to what's going in the database. Is that right?
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah. So the ultimate goal is to show some data, right, on a web page, let's say, or show a web page, and the web page is very likely to have some data. If you think about it, there are not that many web pages who would be static, right? You will have some kind of data in there. Even static pages as articles, as a blogs and stuff like that, they are still being loaded from somewhere else. So and they are very likely to be server side rendered. So yeah, so the ultimate goal is to present something to the user. There are two ways. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
So here, are we talking about is this front end or is this back end? So is this basically helping render stuff from the database, but then to have in the front end code?
Yeah. So this is all happening on the back end, and this syntax is the return to front end, and then in the front end it would just take the syntax and render it in the browser. Okay, so you're basically sending this HTML as a text down to the client, and the client will render it as it would normally do any other web page. If that makes any sense. Do you remember when I was showing you the when we were doing the Express, and I was showing you the requests, right?
Yeah.
And we were doing the different content types
Yes.
in the headers. So for this, the content type, I don't have it in here now, but for this, the content type would be HTML, and instead of JSON, so instead of receiving some kind of JSON and then doing something with it on the front end, it would literally just give you HTML and you would render it. But the point is that it's already being pre-filled with data on the backend. So instead of, I guess the difference would be, instead of actually having to load the page and then make a fetch request to get the data that you then substitute in the page, instead of that, when you make requests for the page, it will do that on the background, on the backend already, and it will just give you the full populated page. That's a server-side rendering. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. I think I see it in concept. I conceptually I understand. I think I maybe need to see how. I mean, I guess we will see that later. But like how you see it in an application, so how it all goes together.
Yeah, I mean,
So the
again,
template is it like a middleware between the backend and the front end?
no, it's a
That's
backend. It's a backend.
okay.
The backend is basically giving you back the whole page instead of giving you data that you then somehow put in the page. If that makes sense.
So basically, you are pre. I mean, you see where my confusion or where my struggle is. So
Yeah.
are we saying that basically that page of the backend, we are kind of pre-doing the work for the front end? So we actually, let's say we have this page where we say hello Thomas.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, we are doing the front end work on the. Is it on the CSS on the HTML side?
Yeah. So you see,
And
this
then
is
putting it to the front end in a static way.
you see, this is the kind of interesting thing because you are the way that you learn all this is already very front end heavy, right? So what you say is we are doing work for the front end, but actually the way that I look at it and the way that kind of still the every like the kind of web industry is looking at it, it's more of a the old way, right? So basically the pages started by all of them being server-side rendered. There hasn't been front end as you doing it now, just like 5-10 years ago or whatever. It was just all server-side rendered. And then when JavaScript became more and more useful and it was getting bigger and everything, then people actually started doing interactions on the front end and started loading data on the front end and everything. So it's not really that the backend would be doing the work for the front end. It's more about difference. Where do you actually render your data? If you're doing it on the front end or if you're doing it on the back end. And both of them are valid. It's just they have different applications and they have different kind of effects basically. So for example, you can, if you submit a form, which you have done that, right? So you have some kind of filters and you're submitting a form. You probably haven't done it in the kind of backend server-side rendered way. You have done it only through the front end. But both of them are basically this, let's say the same. It's just different kind of implementation of it. So the same way that you can submit font form on the backend, you can submit it on the front end as well. So
okay, so basically what you're saying is actually we kind of use this terminology backend, front end, but actually this template view you're showing, you could have that on your front end page, right? So you'd have like this skeleton of kind of view, and then all the data. You would have all the plugs that go to the kind of fetch the data to the database.
yeah, exactly. So
Okay.
it's two different ways, right? So one, you would actually receive this already pre-filled in the browser, from the server in the browser. Or second option is that, as you said, you have some kind of skeleton of a page, and then you do the extra step where you request the data from the server. It will give you the data in a sense of just data, no markup, no styling, nothing, just data, and you would kind of fit it in your page as you wish. So there are just two different approaches.
Okay, got it. So does it mean that for each website page you would have two page? You would have like a static one, like the one that says return to front end, which has the static data, and then you had another one with the template view, or
yeah. So every page has at least one server-side rendered view, which is the index, right? So the
got
index is you need to make a request to the server to get the index first to kind of kick everything off, right? And then after that, it's either other views are server-side rendered as well, and you're navigating by click on links and navigating between pages, or you have a client-side rendered application where you have all the templates already included in the initial request. They are already there. You're just selecting which one to choose and loading data from the backend to fill them in to represent whatever it needs to be represented.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah, so that's the two differences, and you will also hear a lot the term headless, which is used for the front end applications, because basically what it means is that the backend will not tell you how to render the application. It will just give you the data, and you can use it for any client. So it doesn't matter if you're doing website or mobile application, or if you're doing something on a calculator, you can still connect to the same backend. It will give you the same data, and you just represent it as you wish. And that's what is used to call headless applications as well.
Got it.
Cool. So let's go further. Did you have a look at this? Yeah, so I mean, this is just more examples what you can do. You can define different templates. So you can have one template for product, and then you have other template for the products page, right? So you have now two templates, and what we're saying in the products page is I want to render HTML tag, which is normal, and then I want to take products, which is list of some products, and I want to render them, each of them, with using this template. So each of the products would go through this template. It will substitute whatever it needs to be, which is the name in this case, and it would just return the pure HTML, and it would be slotted into here. And then this whole template would be processed as well, and it would be returned to the server, to the client. Any questions about templating? The one that I just showed you with the product, I mean, it might not have been that clear, but like very, very common use case for this would be, imagine that you have, let me just close this. And actually, let me just create a little bit of a structure.
While I listen to Thomas, trying to answer Thomas' questions, I'm trying to think about what would be the best way to explain it. And I came to realize that this is exactly what Thomas said at the beginning, that he's going over the class thinking that, okay, we should not get a general idea, although this might not necessarily be always needed. And it's hard for someone who haven't seen it before to understand it. I totally get the point, because it really, as you mentioned, from an MVC framework, whenever you get the starter code running, you can visually see where the views are, for example, that are going to render in the front end, but it's hard to imagine without having seen it first.
Exactly, and anyway, these like server-side rendering and client-side rendering are not easy concepts to understand, right? And I can see it even now, in different contracts and stuff when I work with different skill levels of people. If there will be a guy who was always doing a server-side rendering applications, and then he goes to team with the where they do client-side server-side rendering application, client-side rendering application, then no matter if he's senior or not, he will struggle with that concept as well. It's just two completely different concepts, and the architecture, the way that it's architected, is completely different as well, right? And there are so many considerations, because there is so many things that you can do with server-side rendering that you cannot do with client-side rendering. For example, you cannot do CSRF tokens and stuff like that. That's basically like a security measure. So there are so many things that you can do with server-side rendering that you cannot do with client-side rendering, and vice versa, right? So server-side rendering is still doing a static page. There is absolutely no interaction from the user. The only interaction is making the request for the page. So the user interaction will be, I want to get a page of product blue jeans, for example. And he will send off the request, right, to the server. And the server will process that and will say, okay, he wants blue jeans. So I will go to the database, I will load everything about the blue jeans. I will calculate how much postage he needs to pay and blah, blah, blah. And he will calculate, the server will do all this. And then it will pack it up into an HTML static page. There is absolutely nothing dynamic about in that page, right? It's all static stuff. So it's just HTML markup. And it will return it to the user. The user will render it in the browser. And what he will see is basically an image of the jeans, how much it costs, and blah, all this data. And then it will say add to the cart. And then add to the cart, if we're talking about server-side rendering applications, will then again, that's the interaction, will again trigger another request to the server and will say, okay, he's looking at blue jeans and he wants to now add them to the cart. And then the server will say, okay, so on the database, I'm gonna make sure that I actually add it to the cart. I will decrease the stock and this and that and that. And then it will again return a static page which will say, you know, it's been added to your cart, go to checkout or something like that. While
no, I was waiting for you to finish. Go ahead.
Yeah. So this is basically the interaction with the user. So you can do a lot of stuff with the data on the server, and you have all the freedom to do it, and it's very secure as well, right? But because the user basically cannot see what's happening, but you can have only this one interaction with the user. So then, if we talk about client-side rendering, then we're talking about all the interactions, but a very limited thing that you can do with the data, right? So when you have client-side rendering application, what you do is you render a page, which is basically, as Thomas said, like a skeleton, and then you request whatever data you need for that page from the server. So you will just say, okay, I'm rendering a product page, and on that product page, I have absolutely nothing. I just know what the structure of that page is. And I know that I need an image, I need some description, and I need to calculate the prices. So in that case, you would probably make like 3 or 4 requests to the server and say, okay, I want to have an image for blue jeans in this size, and I want to know how much the postage is going to be, and this is the parameters for the postage or whatever. And you send that to the server calculates it again into a static piece of data, right? The server always returns static piece of data. It can never do any interactions, right? Only client can do interactions. So it will compile it into a static piece of data and send it back to the user. And the user will take that data, which is probably in some kind of JSON or something like that, and it will then show it on the page. Somehow it will render it on the page. It will decide itself how it will render on the page. If the user wants to change postcode and calculate different shipping, then the client has to make another request to the server and say, again, the server doesn't care about what it calculated before. It will just say, I want to calculate the postage again, and these are the parameters. And server will again do the work and send it back to the client, the static piece of data with that. So that's the kind of difference. So you can do a lot of without any page load, by the way. So you can do a lot of interactions on the client side, but not much data manipulation, while the other way around on the server side. Sorry, Ricardo, what were you saying?
No, I was just going to mention that, and I think I've mentioned this before, this course has given me an amazing amount of information, but things like what we're covering now, for example, what you have just explained, have helped me understand how different the overall, let's say, paradigm is between something like PHP or this, for example. Is not just about knowing the language or the syntax. It's really about this, and this makes a huge difference. So obviously, coming from PHP frameworks like Symfony or Laravel, or just build an own framework in PHP, it's a totally different story to how you will actually code from the backend in JavaScript. So it's is not just about the language. It's, I mean, the
Yeah.
the actual concepts are so extremely different.
Yes, exactly. So what Ricardo said, right? So front end and back end are two very, very different disciplines, right? They are not the same thing. And the most confusing thing, and this is maybe what I find the one bad thing about Node.js. The most confusing thing is when somebody tells you, well, JavaScript, you can write backend. You can't do that, right? Like it's a very, very misleading kind of thing, because just because you can write on a client, you can write JavaScript that you add a listener on a event listener on a button that does something. That doesn't mean that you know how to write a backend, right? It doesn't mean that you know how to write an API or an MVC pattern or something like that. It takes completely different skill set, or completely different architecture, and the architecture is the most important thing here. Completely different architecture to actually achieve what you need on the front end, on the back end. That's why you will have a lot of people from JavaScript claiming that they are full stack developers, because they think that since I can use JavaScript on the front end and on the back end, I am just full stack developer. But it really is completely two different ways of thinking, right? So that's what I'm kind of trying to explain, because you cannot do what you do on the front end, you cannot do on the back end, and vice versa. They have both of them. They have very different goals, what to do, and that's how it needs to be approached. Um, if there would be someone in here a little bit more kind of knowledgeable about new tools, I would already hear them screaming, because what I just told you about people kind of claiming that they are full stack, there has been a lot of tools and a lot of projects trying to bridge this gap, right? So when I tell you that front end and back end are completely different and you need to approach them in different way, there is a lot of people who try to bridge this gap between and make it the same. So they would say, actually, front end and back end are the same. You can do exactly the same thing on both. I personally don't really like this movement, right? Because I just feel like, well, I will give you an example. Does anybody know in here what?
Did like the movement to the no code kind of thing?
Well, I like the movement to no code, but well, let me just explain something, right? So, does anybody know in here what GraphQL is?
I don't, and it's good that you brought it over, because that's one of the things that I have in my go and find out what this is. It's coming from JavaScript. It's supposed to be. It's in high demand, actually. It seems to be around very popular for the last year or so.
Yeah, it is. So what GraphQL is basically is let's say it's an interface between a database and a client. Okay. It's not really 100% true statement, because it's kind of database as well. GraphQL has its own querying syntax and stuff. But basically, what it does is, let's say that you have a backend, right? Let's go back to MySQL, for example. So if I have a backend, let me just do front end. And then we would do backend. Let's do that PHP, for example, right? Doesn't really matter. So now we have front end and back end. We have our front end, which lives on the client side, and we have our back end, which is our server application, basically. So on the front end, if I want to get some data, right? So I know that I have a database somewhere. If I want to get some data, what I have to do is, I cannot actually do, hey database, give me this data. I can't do that, because the database is not reachable from front end, or at least shouldn't be anyway. The front end cannot query a database, right? While backend can, right? So the backend will know, it will have some kind of like MySQL connector, actually. Yeah. So you will have some kind of MySQL connector, and it will say, you know, MySQL or whatever it is now.
Are you trying to show your screen because it's not showing?
It's not, my screen is not showing.
I mean, for me, it's fixing the presentation. And if you're doing something different, I don't see how it fix me.
Oh wow! Have you not seen anything that I was writing in the code? That's not good.
Somebody else? Have you guys seen it? Because I haven't.
Have you guys seen my code editor before? Okay, I think it's just me and you, Ricardo, right now.
Well, strange. I'm here.
Let me just stop presenting and start again. That is very strange because you should be able to see that, but for the entire screen, screen one.
Well, Christina seems to be here, but muted, and Thomas, yeah, he's coming back. Seems like he was off.
Yeah, but I'm here. I hear you.
Okay, Christina, and you don't see the code, right? You just see the presentation.
Yeah, I don't see the screen here.
Can you see my screen now?
Yeah, we can.
Can you see the code editor?
Yes.
Can you see the code editor, Ricardo?
Yes, I can see it now.
Okay. Okay, so going back to this, so if on the front end, you cannot really ask database for data, you cannot query the database. On the back end, you can, right? So you will have something like MySQL Connect, then you would say localhost, for example. I'm just making this up anyway. And then you would say, you know, MySQL connector, query, and you would say select everything from user. Okay, something like that. So let's say something like this. So you can do this on the backend. If you want to get data from the database, what you have to do is you need to go through the backend. So you need to say fetch, you know, www.backend.com, and I want to get the users. Right? So you would do something like this. I mean, this is not correct code, but anyway. So you would have to go through the backend through some kind of API to load data, and the backend will then receive that request. It goes to the database and loads the data, yeah, and then returns it back. So this is the separation of concerns, really. So the front end has absolutely no idea about database or anything like that. It will just ask for users from the backend, and the backend then loads it from the database. So for example, on the front end, if I'm requesting users, I don't know if it's stored in Mongo or if it's stored on MySQL or if the backend just remembers all these users. I have absolutely no idea as long as it gives me the users, right? So now the GraphQL people thought, well, I mean, no, I don't want to say the GraphQL people thought, but basically, why is GraphQL so popular lately? Is because there's a lot of front-end developers who think they are full stack because they know how to write JavaScript, and obviously Node.js is on the back end. So they would say, well, you know, I want to be querying the database. Sorry?
Sounds funny to hear it, but thanks for the information.
Yeah.
So you kind of broke at the end of the sentence about the GraphQL people, but
yeah. So the GraphQL, so basically front-end developers would thought, well, we cannot write a proper backend because we are not backend developers, really. We are just front-end developers. So what can we do about that? So GraphQL came about and said, how about we just give all the capability that we can do on the backend with querying database to the front end. So what if on the front end you then do, you know, something like this? You would do GraphQL query, and then you can just do the same thing basically. This is just an example that doesn't really work, but anyway, right? So basically on the front end now you can do this, and it will go directly into the database and get you the data that you want. So that means you are not anymore restricted to what the API returns. You can select your own stuff. Yeah. So for example, if I want to get an object like this, so I would say, okay, I want to get a user object, and I want it to be a first name and last name. Okay, so I want to get this kind of object. So then you would take this requirement and you would give it to backend, and the backend will say, okay, you will call a user /1 /ID, let's say /ID endpoint, and I will give you this kind of data. Okay, the next day, so they will develop it, everything is good. Next day, the front enders will say, oh, actually, I need an address as well of the user to kind of print it out on the page. So in this case, we as a front enders, we need to go back to the backend and say, look, I need you to change your endpoint and add address in the return. I want you to load the address from the database and return it with the data as well. So then the backenders would go and they would change their request, sorry, the API endpoint to return this, and so on and so on. So every time you want to change the data that you're actually getting from your requests, you would have to go to backend, ask them to do it. So GraphQL tried to address this.
Is it just me, right? Or I'm losing you a bit, Thomas. Is it just me, or
Oh no,
Ricardo and Christian, you hear them as well?
Oh, I think we lost Ricardo. It might be the
Yeah, not too.
You too? Okay, I'm really sorry about that. I think my connection is starting to act up again. What did you
No, it's good.
what did you understand?
No, I think I understand. I just wanted to make sure I'm not the only one kind of losing you from time to time.
Okay.
So no, you were saying so if the front end you add the address, then how does it impact the backend?
Yeah, so if the front end adds if the front end wants to now render the address, it needs to go to the backend and say, please change this endpoint to return address as well. Okay, so that's the normal kind of contract between front end and backend. What GraphQL is doing, right? So what GraphQL is trying to do is that you can actually query the database yourself. So if you need address, you don't have to go to your backend. You don't have to go to your API. You just change it in your front end. So you literally query the database like you would on the backend. So you're giving the power to shape the data as you wish on the front end to front enders rather than keeping it on the back end. If that makes any sense. Does that make any sense?
Sorry, I mean, from on my side, you broke out a bit.
Yeah.
Quite. I think. Yeah, we couldn't hear you really well.
I'm so sorry. Let me just, you know what? Let me park this for a bit, and let's go back to the presentation. So at least we finish what we should be finishing today, and then we can keep talking about GraphQL and other stuff. Maybe the connection will sort out a little bit because yeah, I'm trying to put my phone in different locations on the window and stuff. So hopefully it will catch some things. Right. So we were talking about the templating engines. Let me just show you. Hopefully you can hear me, understand me. What I mean by templating. What you would end up with would be something like this. So you would have a couple of HTML files. Each of them are templates. Each of them are templates or views, whatever you want to call it. In index, sorry, let's just start with, like, for example, content. So in content, you would say, I will have an like article, and inside of the article, I will have the content of the article. Okay, and then you would have a header, and inside of the header, you would have some kind of menu, for example. So you would have nav, and here you would have menu items map. Right, something like this. So now we have our header, and in the footer you would have pretty much the same thing. You just have it in the footer. That's it. And then in here you would have copyright 2020 coders, right, something like this. So now we have kind of pieces of the content. We know that this is the article, this is how footer will look like, and this is how header will look like. You will see that this is not an HTML, this is the templating, right? And then in the index, what you would do is you would just say, okay, I'm rendering now a header, HTML, for example. Every templating language has different syntax, so I'm just gonna show you kind of like a pseudo code in here. And then we render the content and the footer. And each of them would have some kind of data, so the header would have menu items, which will be basically the menu items. No, let's do header menu. The content would have the article, which was content. Okay, so the content would have content as article, and footer would have footer menu. Okay, so this is very roughly, this is just pseudocode, right? This is very roughly how you would structure a template on the backend, right? So instead of having actual HTML files, it looks like an HTML, but what it really is this kind of templating language that any engine will define how to do it. And you're just passing in the data. So you're saying, I want to render header HTML, which is here, right? And I want to give it a data, which is menu items, and this is the value for that menu items. And then when I go to header, it will render some kind of HTML, and then it will say for all the menu items, map them into more HTML, basically. Right, this would probably be something like this. So in this case, once you pass it in, it would just render static HTML with all the data. And it would kind of connect all these pieces together, and in the end, it would give you a static HTML page with just static data in it. So this is how we use templates, basically. We kind of create small pieces of HTML that we then reuse throughout the application. So now, if I would create a new view, you could basically say something like, I can create a new view in here, and I can say this is my, product page, and I can reuse the same header and footer from the index. So I could just say, this is my header, and this is my footer, and then in between I would have, this is my product. Actually, just to keep it consistent. Yeah, so you can then reuse these templates as well throughout the application. So this is whole kind of setup that you would have to learn basically how to use.
So is that the way it usually works? So that you will have actually an object product name that will render a HTML code.
Yeah, so you would have this in your HTML. You see that it's not valid HTML, but you would have this in your HTML file, It might have different extension because of the templating engine. Every templating engine defines something different. But you would pass in the product, and then as you would run it through the templating engine, it would basically take this and it would parse it. So the result would then be, everything from here. Oh, what happened there? Wow. No. Okay. So the result would be and then in here you would have some kind of items. And then you would have your, what do we have in there? This product, which might be just product blue jeans. And then you will have your footer. And you will have this. And then you could wrap it in a page. So you would say this is my body. This will be your body. Okay, so you see this will be your template. You're saying load this other template and give it some data, then render my product name in a title, and then load again another template with some data, and the result would be 100% static HTML. You can see there's nothing strange about this, and it would just basically contain all the markup from whatever you define in there. So what would the server side rendering, what would the backend actually return to the front end? No JavaScript, no interactions, nothing. It would just return this basically. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So the templating engines, we still need to write out HTML because, yeah, I mean, normally you would do some kind of HTML and then just put a little bit of, kind of sprinkle a little bit of the templating syntax in, and that will be then replaced with the engine. The Lodash templating engine is limited because obviously Lodash is not like 100% templating engine project. It's just kind of gives you as a nicety. And there are other templating engines which are full-blown templating engines. Some are Twig, Hamel, Handlebars, Mustache. Mustache and Handlebars used to be very, very popular. Most of these are, again, single page applications, right? Because once single page applications came, like React and Angular and all these kind of frameworks and libraries, the server-side rendered applications kind of went on the back burner. Then they are not as popular now. So all these libraries are not as popular as they used to be, but they are still used, and I would say especially Handlebars and Mustache. We will look at Puck. Puck is for, JavaScript is kind of the simplest, I would say, templating engine. So what you do is, you can see in here product page, right? So this will be our result HTML, and in here we say Puck, which is the templating engine, and compile file. So compile my template file and in this case it's products.puck. So they have even different extension. It's not HTML extension, it's just different extension. And what you do is you will say, get me some data from the database, and then render that page. So the page that we created in here from this file, render that page with the data that we just loaded from the database. You can see that this is what is in your Puck file. So HTML head, title, body, h1 message. So the Puck language went even further, and you don't actually write any valid HTML. You just write it like this. So you just basically write it without the chevrons and other stuff. And you can do mixins and all the other things. This is all something you will probably not use, so I'm just kind of skimming through it. But you can see that basically it's almost like another language. If you think about HTML and what it is, HTML is a markup language, right? So what we mean by that, there is no logic in HTML. You can just create a markup of a page. So these, and obviously that has some kind of disadvantages because you cannot repeat stuff, you cannot do conditions and so on. So these kind of templating has been basically done so you can do that. So you can do all this nice logic that you want to do, and then it compiles down into HTML. And if that sounds familiar, it might be because we talked before about TypeScript, right? And TypeScript does pretty much the same thing for JavaScript. So it's a kind of like a superset of JavaScript where you can add some extra stuff to JavaScript, and then it compiles down to just pure JavaScript, basically, on some kind of set of rules. So this is exactly the same thing. You can write something that resembles HTML, but it's not actually HTML. And then once you compile it, it will compile into just pure HTML. So there's more about how to use Puck files. And then in your Express, so this is why we are looking at Puck, because it's quite easy to use it with Express. You can just say, okay, I want to use this view engine with this templating engine. And then you can just say render, give it the name of the template and the data. It will render the actual data. It will render the actual HTML. Any questions about Puck or templating engines in general, I would say?
Not for me, no, thank you.
Okay, so that's it for the presentation. So let's just try to do a little bit of a Puck just to kind of see if we can get somewhere. We still have some time. And are you hearing me fine?
Yeah, no, it works fine now.
Cool. So let's just do something quickly in here. Terminal. So we will create a new project. And we will say, okay, this is our index.js. We will install Express. Let's create our application. So this should be all familiar stuff already from your projects and stuff. So I can say up because actually let's do Express.
Why you don't call it up?
I will call the next one up just because we might need actual Express as well for this.
Ah, okay.
And then we say up listen, and let's do it port 350 should be fine. So now if I do npx, no, sorry, no. Okay, so we should have our application. If I now if I now go to, that's not that. If I now go to localhost 2500, yeah, so I'm already inside of my application. Cool. So now, what does the tell us? We need to set the view engine. So this is basically setting something on the application. Set the view engine to Puck. So let's do that, and we will say up set view engine to Puck. So potentially now we should be able to use Puck, right? So now if we create views, use product Puck, you can see that Puck is already recognized because it's quite common to use it. So now we need to create our view. So in Puck, you don't write HTML, you write something that resembles like HTML. So you would just write, this is our HTML. Let's say it's going to be HTML5. Nice. It already has some kind of presets as well. And in the body, in the body we would say h1 hello world. Okay. And now we will say that in the app, when we request the index, we will return product. So now that I think we should.
How are you linking to your product Pug on your index.js?
So you don't, by setting this, the view engine, the Puck, will know exactly where to look for. So it will look for the views folder in your project, and then inside of it, it will look for the same name of a file, basically.
Ah, okay. Wow.
Yeah, it's a framework, so it will do all this kind of stuff for you. But I think we might have to. Let me just see if we need to install something in here. I haven't done Puck for a long time as well. Let's Google it.
Man, when I came in this bootcamp, I didn't know I would have all these different languages.
Yeah, I mean it's a bit of a wild west right now in you know in especially in JavaScript, and it's funny because it's not necessarily like different languages, it's just tools, right? But they all have kind of different syntax because they want to achieve something, and they, you know, in JavaScript people like to kind of create these pre-processors and stuff like that because it's just they can then write the syntax as they wish, as they feel like it's really nice, basically. So so then you will end up with a lot of having to basically learn a lot of different syntax just because of that, which is a bit unfortunate. But that's what we do every day, just learn and learn. Let's try if this is gonna work now. Yeah. It might be outdated in there. So you do. Yeah, it should work. Not sure why it doesn't work. Oh, of course. Press this request and then it response. I probably didn't even have to install the pack. Right, so now we have the hello world. So now we basically, and if you look at how it looks like, so this is our, actually let me just, page source. So this is what we return, this is what the server, so our server, this thing, what it actually returns. It will return an doc type, HTML, and all this kind of stuff. And it will say, this is our title. In the body, we have h1 hello and body HTML. So this is basically, we are taking our product page and we are rendering it in here. And if you look at what is in here, it's basically what you saw in there. So you have meta and title and so on. So now, what we can do is we can pass in some variables. So we will say, let's pass a name. Right, so we will say in here, we have a name, and it's Thomas. And in here we can say hello world. And if we look at what we do in here, see, so again, it has its own kind of syntax, how you do loops and things like that. So let me just do. Actually, we'll have to Google this as well because I haven't done this further. So if you look at the pack website, interpolation, that's exactly what you're looking for. And then you would do, yeah, so you would do hash and a curly bracket, that's what they use. So you should potentially be able to do this and say name. So let's see what happens now if we go back to here. See, we have hello world Thomas. So now what we did is we took this template. There is no concrete name in here. It's actually just a value, and we passing the value through our backend, right? Through our, and this would be called controller in the MVC pattern, right? So the same way we can pass any kind of values, and we can render it in here. So now what we can do, just to show you how kind of slightly different what you can do with it. Let's say that we get the name from the request. So on the request, we will have something called, I'm pretty sure it's going to be query params or search params. Let me just check.
And so to cut you, Thomas, but so the way we were doing it so far, so having a variable named name, for example, and that comes from the JS file, isn't there an argument where you could say, well, actually you could use that way we used to do it and also get access to the database? I don't know if what I say makes sense, but the way we, so far, we've done our exercises and done our kind of projects was to have in the HTML, well, no, actually, it was not in the HTML file directly. It was in the JavaScript file.
Yeah.
Something that would say what the file needs to look like.
But is that for front end though?
For front end, yeah.
But
I guess my question is the way we've approached things like so until now kind of completely we need to kind of forget about it, or
no.
Or is there a way to access backend with the way we used to do it?
You would be still accessing backend the way that you used to do it. This is just showing you on the backend what you could do. This has nothing to do with front end. So all what we're talking about now, all this kind of templating engines and everything, that's all 100% backend. There are no templating.
Okay. When we say hello Thomas, it's actually hello Thomas. You're accessing the database.
Yeah, exactly. So just to show you how it would be a little bit more dynamic, what I'm saying in here is we are rendering a product page, let's say, and we are passing in parameter name, and the parameter name is coming from the actual request that when we're requesting the page. Yeah, so it's coming from the query. So now just to show you how it looks like.
So we're kind of doing a postman, but we're doing our own postman kind of thing.
Yeah, pretty much. So now we have nothing in there. So that's that. If I now go and say name equals, Zoe, then we should see hello world Zoe. Yeah, so because we put this parameter in the request, it will take it and it will render the HTML with it and then pass it back to the browser. Does it make sense? And this is just an example of, that we took some kind of dynamic value and passed it into name. As you said, this could be a database request, so we could get actually data from database, put it in here, and then it would be rendered over here, right? And I think this is probably as far as like what I would show you, because the more I will show you, the more confusing it will get, even more than it is now, I'm sure. It's just, these things, they are definitely, you can read, if you are really interested in it, you can read their documentation and they will show you exactly what you can do with the templates and how to kind of fit them together. But just to kind of, I'm trying you to understand the concept of basically requesting something. So we're going from this URL, like forget about the page, just look at the URL. So this is our request, this is our user interaction. We wrote this in the address bar in the browser, right? And we go from that into a static HTML page. So you go into this page basically. And the way that it's done is on the backend, we accept the interaction, we accept the request. We will take the values from the request and then we will put it into whatever the template has been created before. So we have a template where we'll say hello world and some kind of dynamic value, and that dynamic value in this case is coming from here. So the whole concept of making this round trip to the backend and the backend then returning you something based on what you just requested is what I'm kind of hoping that you would understand. But please, look, we have a little bit more time. I think my connection is, I'm not sure if it's good, but we have a little bit more time. So if you have any questions or about anything, just tell me now. How are you understanding it, Christina?
Well, not very well, but I think I need time to understand this. It's really hard to understand backend for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean it is.
If front end says something like JavaScript, HTML, CSS, I can understand that this one. Yeah, I need time.
Yeah, I mean, I said this before. This is not easy concept to understand, especially for someone already understanding the other one, right? So if you would, I mean, you cannot learn both at the same time. So you will learn one. In your case, it was more about learning the front end, so the architecture of the front end. So you create a page and then with JavaScript you manipulate it, you request more data, you put it on the page, and so on. So that's what you know, which is perfectly fine. And this is just another way to achieve basically the presentation of what you want, right? So if somebody will tell you, look, I want to have a page with like a graph of all the stocks in last 2 weeks or something like that, whatever stock prices in last 2 weeks, then you have two options to achieve that. One would be to create your front end and then do a fetch to the back end, load the data, and render the graph. Or the other approach would be to just tell the same input to the backend. The backend would process everything, create the graph and all that stuff, and it would just send you back the static thing, and you would just render it. Right. So now, if there are no other questions, are there any other questions?
No, I didn't have.
No.
Thank
Okay.
you.
So if there are no other questions, then let me just talk to you a little bit more about kind of like hybrids between them, right? So obviously nothing is white and black, unfortunately, but there are some kind of hybrid approaches to this as well, especially when it comes to rendering just pieces of data, or let's say components or something like that on the backend. So what you could potentially do is to create a hybrid where you load the page. You load the page, and when you request the data, you will actually tell the backend, I want this data, but I want them in an HTML form. So you tell me how you want me to render it, and just give me the markup, and I will place it somewhere on the page. Right? So you can do that as well. So instead of requesting data and then manipulating it and rendering everything on the front end, you can just basically request pieces of the web page from the backend. And this is being used a lot on the dashboards. Like, for example, if you have some, like Google, let's say Google tracking or something. Google Analytics, yeah. So if you look at their dashboard, you can see in here, then you will see that they have this widget which shows some kind of user something. Then they have this widget, and they have this widget, like for example this is quite complex widget and stuff. So these ones, I mean, obviously I don't really know but how they do it, but in some cases these things could be a standalone HTML fragments basically. So when this page loads, it will say, okay, I'm loading this page, now please give me how did the widget for how do you acquire users, and the backend would actually return this whole thing, this whole HTML it would return, including all the JavaScript that is needed for the interactions. So if I switch between tabs, or you see this little floating window that follows my mouse, that's all JavaScript, and that might be included in this widget, right? So when it returns the HTML, it might include all the JavaScript and styling and everything, just to kind of place it on the page. So it is being used in the dashboards or some kind of embeddable web content, basically, where you would piece your web page from multiple kind of pieces of HTML. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, I mean, it has some advantages, disadvantages. Obviously, the advantage is that you don't have to do much on the front end, and obviously, you could potentially, you don't really have to release on the front end to change the look of the website or something like that. You can just change it on the back end, and the users will just start receiving the new version. The drawbacks of doing this would be, well, the same thing, that you basically can't control it, right? You're receiving the data from the backend and you're rendering it. If somebody on the backend does a mistake, or they change slightly the way that, if they change slightly the font for this widget and not for this one, then it will look different. It's not going to be consistent. And there are other drawbacks that could this be as well. But that being said, this is actually now kind of upcoming where you're loading fragments of HTML rather than just raw data and then placing them on a page. It can actually save quite a bit of processing power, and the logic, it could be kind of the whole thing where you separate the concern of business logic. So the business logic lives somewhere and the client doesn't need to know about it, and it will just receive the static data. Is quite appealing for business especially. So it is a bit upcoming now to load fragments of HTML rather than the raw data. But as a developer, I would feel like I would rather get the raw data and then process it myself, so we can fit it exactly as we need on the page, rather than backend giving us some kind of slop of data basically and putting it on the page. Also, there are some security concerns as well, because obviously you're putting, you're receiving some kind of HTML and JavaScript and styles and things like that, and you just putting it on the page to render. You need to be very careful about it, because there could be some malicious code in there that could be executed if you put it on the user's computer. Right. I think we will conclude it in here, because yeah, my phone is already screaming that it's almost dead. So I'm gonna be disconnected soon anyway. I'm sorry, but if you have any questions, just let me know. Otherwise, I will let you to it. Leave you to it.
Great, thank you, Thomas.
I hope it didn't confuse you even further. But don't take it too seriously, this topic. It's nice to just know about it.
Thank you, Thomas. No, it was good. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
See you. Bye bye.
All right. See ya.
Bye.